Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabarty. Today we are going to be continuing on to talk about the Super Bowl. Of course, it is Super Bowl week, so naturally we're going to start off every show talking about that. Today on that front, I want to sort of break down the positional groups for both teams and give my thoughts on who has the advantage between the two teams at each of those groups. Then we are going to be talking about Bryce Young, actually the number one overall pick for the Panthers last season. There was a very interesting conversation going on the internet that I was compelled by, that I just sort of want to talk about, and I haven't had the chance to give my thoughts on him as a whole, so I'm going to do that. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking some NBA, starting with the Milwaukee Bucks, who fall to 1-4 since Doc Rivers has taken over as their head coach on the sidelines. So going to be giving my thoughts on what point it is we should start worrying about this team. And finally, going to give my thoughts on a couple of the games from last night in the Bulls and the Mavericks wins, plus an update on the NBA trade deadline. But before we get into anything, just a reminder to like and follow, and to remember to use the chat to make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would like to tip or donate, use the link at the bottom of the screen. That is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. So without further ado, getting into our first segment here, talking about the positional matchups for the upcoming Super Bowl against the Niners and the Chiefs. I'm just going to go through each of the different groups and say which I believe has the advantage going forward for this game, and also just sort of key in on different groups that I think are going to be the most significant for this matchup in particular. Starting off with quarterbacks, there's really not too much to say on this front. It is Patrick Mahomes versus Brock Purdy. Mahomes is on a tier of his own, so he's playing for legacy stuff as far as becoming an all-timer. He already is, but to really put himself in that upper echelon, whereas Brock Purdy is really more so just looking to establish himself. So there's really not too much that needs to be said on that front. Obviously goes to the Chiefs. As far as running backs, I think that this is the 49ers. Isaiah Pacheco is a very good young player, and I think that he's added a very different element to the Kansas City Chiefs game and their identity over the course of the past two seasons. He was a day 3 pick for the Chiefs a couple years ago, and he has helped transform the Chiefs to be less one-dimensional. Of course, in the first few Mahomes Chiefs seasons, it was so pass-centric and fixated on Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill. They had to make tough decisions letting Hill go, and Isaiah Pacheco has really helped be that guy to sort of uplift their running game. And it's interesting because it was not all that long ago that Clyde Edwards-Helaire was a first-round running back draft choice for them, and he was serviceable for their first couple Super Bowl runs, but really Pacheco has been the one to elevate it to a different level, which has been just so timely for them, because without him, it would be very hard for them to continue to do what they've been doing and have this more balanced attack. And quick note on the balanced attack front, it is very true. I think that Pacheco has been so vital for them. I also do, just when it comes to this conversation, I think a lot of people are sort of spinning the way that Ravens and Chiefs game to a different level, saying, oh, the Chiefs were just trying to chew clock. They knew that they were going to be able to get stops, and they just wanted to, keep the ball on the ground and take up as much time as possible. I just don't believe that the Chiefs were trying to run out the clock for the entire second half. And I think that more so, it's not about Mahomes. Not every single thing about the Chiefs has to be about Mahomes. I think it speaks more to the defense. And yes, you have a little bit more of an option on the run game when you have Isaiah Pacheco, but I just feel like the sort of fallout as we're getting, further from the game, the Chiefs offense got shut down. That's what happened in the second half. They scored 0 points, but they were able to win because, yes, there was at least more faith in the run game, and Pacheco doesn't make the negative plays. He doesn't struggle with fumbling, so he adds that element to them, but that was not the entire game plan of the second half. Quick little tangent there. It's just something I've been hearing a lot in the national sports media, and I just don't think that we can just forget what actually happened in that last game. But on the note of running backs here, again, Pacheco, great. Christian McCaffrey, greater. He is the best running back in the NFL, in my opinion, when fully healthy. He is the most valuable player on the 49ers as far as their offense goes. Love Brock Purdy as well, but Christian McCaffrey is really the engine that gets going, which is why having 2 weeks to prepare for this 49ers offense, you have to believe that Steve Spagnuolo, the Chiefs defensive coordinator, and that entire coaching staff, that defense, has been focused in on, can we force Christian McCaffrey out of the game? And you're never going to be able to fully eliminate him. I mean, he was even slow getting going in the first half of that Lions game. If you remember on the broadcast, they kept flashing that statistic about 3 Detroit rushers that were outgaining Christian McCaffrey between Gibbs, Montgomery, and Jameson Williams, who had the end around that went for a 40-yard touchdown. So, it started slow for them, and as a result, the Chiefs weren't, or the 49ers, I should say, weren't able to get going once they started feeding him, the best running back in the league, and the reason why I'm picking them over him and that running back group over the Chiefs running back group, because they got him and Deebo Samuel going and allowed them to play their game more. So on that note of Deebo and the receiver core, I think that this is probably just about as big of a gap, other than maybe the quarterback group, but the difference is I think that Brock Purdy is still good, solid. The Chiefs receivers are still not good, and I know that they've been better, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling had the big catch to sort of ice the game last week on third down, but I still don't have all too much confidence in the Chiefs to their receivers to actually show up and for them to individually make plays. Now, you have Patrick Mahomes at quarterback. You have a good running back in Isaiah Pacheco. Can these receivers win the one-on-one matchups against the 49ers defensive backs that can be, not a liability, but they can be beaten? Who on the Chiefs receiving end is going to do so? Rashee Rice has put together a very solid rookie season. He's come along more and more as the year goes. They are going to need him to step up, but all in all, from receivers 1 through 5, I think that this is the 49ers all day. Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Jawan Jennings came up big for them in the Green Bay game in the divisional round. I think that the 49ers just, they've been consistent. They haven't been dropping the ball as much. The Chiefs, on the other end, they have guys with incredible drop percentages, and incredible not in a good way, but they have that. They have the whole Kadarius Toney saga that's going on right now. Just, they're a little bit of a mess as a group. Now, lucky for them, when you move on to the tight ends here, where Travis Kelce is essentially their best receiver, I know that this isn't maybe the most popular national opinion right now, somewhat because of sort of the underlying storylines going into this game. But if I'm talking for one Super Bowl, one game, who would I rather have, Travis Kelce or George Kittle? I'm going with Travis Kelce. George Kittle is the better tight end as a whole. He was an all-pro guy this year. Meanwhile, Travis Kelce really showed his first signs of slowing down significantly during the course of the regular season. But I think that we've seen him elevate his game once again. We're now talking about the guy who has the all-time most playoff receptions in NFL history. That is for a reason. It's because Mahomes loves him for a good reason. He goes to him in all of these big third downs, big spots, and Kelce gets it done. George Kittle, again, better all-around tight end. Blocking is a very important part of the position. Maybe not quite as much when the league was more ground and pound, but you see the George Kittle clips of him going berserk on the offensive line, laughing at guys after plowing them over. He's a psycho in the best way possible. And he's somebody that, again, if I'm building my team long term at this point, or even for the full course of a season where I need consistency every single game from him, I'm going with George Kittle to build my offense around. But in this particular moment, I think that Travis Kelce is going to be a bigger factor. Now, Kittle has been a little quiet, still to his standards, I suppose I should preface that as a little quiet. Through their first couple playoff wins, he had that 30-yard touchdown, and he had a handful of catches against the Packers, and had a catch, I believe, on their game-winning drive as well. So it's not like he's been invisible, but only 2 catches for 27 yards last week. Meanwhile, Kelce is going 11 catches for 116 yards, and he's had touchdowns in multiple games now. And, it's a tough position here. These are 2 of the greatest tight ends in the league today and have been for the past handful of seasons. George Kittle finally putting together a healthy year. And who knows, if the Chiefs come out and they try and put all this extra attention on shutting down Christian McCaffrey in the run game, then maybe this is the playoff game that Kittle really breaks out. We'll see. But again, I'm giving the slight edge to the Kansas City Chiefs and specifically Travis Kelce over Kittle. Offensive line, sort of forgotten about. I feel like a lot of the times, even though every time I'm on this show, I seem to be talking about offensive line and the line of scrimmage. But I give again, a little bit of a slight edge, but to the Chiefs. I know they are missing their all-pro guard, Joe Thuney. Last week, it was Nick Allegretti starting in his place. Got to be honest, I haven't been crunching the film on him. It wasn't significantly that he, got bodied. He wasn't, allowing sacks or anything. He got pushed around a little bit in the run game, but not to a point where I think that he's a massive liability. And speaking of liabilities, that's maybe a little bit dramatic, but the 49ers right tackle has been struggling a lot as of late. Colton McKivitz allowed a handful of sacks during the playoffs this run and late in the season, and somebody that, I think that there's a real chance that once we sort of start talking about the defense here, could get pushed around a little bit. Trent Williams is still a monster, another all-pro first-team selection for him on the left side, but I think that right side is a little vulnerable. And moving on to the defensive line groups here, I do give the slight edge to the 49ers, and maybe I'm just a prisoner of the hype almost. You look at those names, I've talked about it on this show, you feel like they should maybe be getting a little more production than they are when you have Bosa, Chase Young, Javon Hargrave, and Eric Armstead. They're all healthy. They just haven't really been getting the push you would expect them to, given all of their individual reputations. So, maybe I'm a sucker. They are more well-rounded, though, than the Chiefs. I think that the Chiefs have 2 stars. Chris Jones is the best player just about at his position as far as interior defensive linemen in the year 2023-24. And I think that their first-round pick from last season, George Karlaftis, has really come along for them. He was up to double-digit sacks this season. He has handful of QB hits. I think it's 4 through the first couple playoff games, along with 2.5 sacks. So he's really come along as well. I would expect to line him up on that edge against McKivitz to try and get a little bit of a mismatch there. I really like what he's been doing for the Chiefs as of late in this sort of rebuilding of the Chiefs defense that can help be more of the identity than we have seen in the past. Moving on to linebackers, it has to be the 49ers. I mean, just another example of you're talking about one of the guys, the best at their position, Fred Warner. I think he's the best linebacker in football. He is an animal. He's everywhere. And I thought that it was interesting the way that coming out of media day, he was talking about a little bit. He knows that he can be a little more aggressive on that front end, and it comes off on film. But because he talked about the faith that he sort of had in some of those back end guys to help cover him up, there was an interesting exchange. Tayshaun Gibson, their safety, who we're going to be getting to momentarily, talked about the pass deflection that he had against Sam Laporta. Shout out Theo Ash for the great interview questions there. But a very good linebacker duo between Fred Warner and Dre Greenlaw, obviously. And the Chiefs absolutely have a good linebacking core themselves. They have Willie Gay coming back from injury this week. They have Drew Tranquil. They have Nick Bolton, Bolton has been another one of these leaders for them on defense that has really made a big difference for them in sort of rearing its head on the defensive side of the ball. So I like the Kansas City Chiefs, but just between those two, you can't really pick them over the 49ers. But again, don't overlook the Chiefs linebacking group is what I should say. Defensive backs, I would say it's pretty handedly the Kansas City Chiefs. I just think they have the all-pro talent in L'Jarius Sneed and Trent McDuffie. Their safeties between Eric Reed and Mike Edwards are both very solid as well. There's really no holes in the secondary there for them. They are very set up nicely in this and has been a big part of it. San Francisco, they lose obviously a key piece of that with Talanoa Hufanga, who was an all-pro player for them last season. They lose him after about 10 games or so this year. Jair Brown has stepped in, and he's been solid in that role. He was a third-round rookie for them. He's been playing the position fine, but obviously not the all-pro level. And as a result, they just don't really have any of those stars like the Chiefs do in the secondary. Charvarius Ward, the former Chief that was with the Chiefs the last time these teams matched up, he's a very good player in his own right. And then Ambry Thomas has come along as the year has been put together, but just sort of a lot on his shoulders. Thomas didn't start for a stretch. I know he was dealing with some injuries, but for about 2 months during the regular season, he was sort of not starting, in and out of the starting group for that San Francisco back end. Lenore's a solid player too, but again, I just think that they definitely have the ability to allow big plays. Now, the Chiefs haven't been the most explosive deep play offense, but when you have Patrick Mahomes at quarterback, it's always possible. He can put the deep balls on his guys, so we will see. And then finally, special teams, I give the edge to Kansas City. Mostly talking about kickers here. Harrison Butker has been in the moment plenty of times now through these runs with the Chiefs, so you don't really have any questions there. The 49ers are starting a rookie kicker in Jake Moody, who has had some ups and downs. He's been mostly solid for them, but this does feel like it could be a game that comes down to special teams a little bit, and I would have a little bit of a hesitation there. And finally, as far as coaches go, two great coaching staffs, really, from their head coaches and down. I really like both defensive coordinators in this game as well. And then obviously, between Andy Reid and Shanahan, the offensive coordinator maybe isn't quite as important of a role, but I'm giving the edge to the Chiefs. We've just seen Andy Reid do it before. He's been a very prominent coach throughout the past decade plus, and Shanahan is also another great offensive line. In some ways, you can make the argument that Reid sort of paved the way in some sense as far as creativity and offensive mindedness, and allowing that to be the sort of movement of offensive minded head coaches in the NFL, at least as of recent years. And I would like to leave behind this Shanahan choker talk and not being able to come back, but it obviously has been part of his story, partially due to the last time these two teams met in the Super Bowl. It was Shanahan's offense going cold down the stretch and Andy Reid's offense scoring 21 straight points to go and win that game. So that is what I have for at least each individual position. I'll count it up and see who we give the points to, but for now we're going to be taking a break, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to move off of the Super Bowl briefly and talk about actually a rookie quarterback situation from this past season, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some motion shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the positional matchups between the Chiefs and the 49ers. After a final tally, including special teams and coaches, the Chiefs were better in 6 out of the 10 positions that we went over. So by that metric, at least it is favor of the Chiefs, but that's just my opinion there. Moving on to another NFL story and talking about the number 1 overall draft pick from this past season, Bryce Young. And I think that there's a very interesting way that we go about really evaluating all young quarterbacks. And it's a lot of the time, I think, toxic and messy, but it's also very inconsistent in my opinion. So Bryce Young, if you don't know, he, coming from Alabama, former Heisman winner, the Carolina Panthers traded up to the number 1 pick, including trading their first round pick from this year, which now is the number 1 overall pick. So they gave up a whole lot to go up and get Bryce Young. Coming into last season, everybody was aware that the Panthers situation as a whole was far less than ideal. They really didn't have any playmakers. They went and they signed a couple, solid guys that have been on solid teams. Miles Sanders, they signed Hayden Hurst, Adam Thielen, and old Adam Thielen at that. But they really didn't have all too many weapons, especially considering the fact that another part of that trade was giving up their number 1 receiver, DJ Moore, to go up and get Bryce Young. So I think all in all, it was never going to be an easy year for Bryce Young here in Carolina. And that was very much displayed by the results of the season, ending up with the number 1 overall draft position again, other than the fact that they don't actually have that pick. It was a very rough year. They finished 2-15, and it never really looked good. And that is a little bit of my issue here. So as a whole, I don't like to try and write off young guys, especially at the quarterback position, which is obviously such a difficult position and one of the most heavily scrutinized positions. So I don't really like bringing, the negativity necessarily to those arguments. Now, That being said, I feel like there's some level of apologies and forgiveness that has been given out to Bryce Young that we don't do for other quarterbacks, and it's not alone. I guess part of where my perspective from this comes is being a Patriots fan. Mac Jones, let's get ahead of it, he was never going to be a superstar quarterback, but he wasn't in the trajectory to be a bad quarterback, nowhere near as bad as he was this season. He was a Pro Bowler, granted an alternate, granted the Pro Bowl doesn't really mean anything, but he had a good year in his rookie season. I feel like, maybe it's an easy comparison here, I feel like he's very similar to Brock Purdy in a lot of ways. He doesn't necessarily have the anticipation, at least as of this year. Obviously, it's, it becomes a little foggy because of, Mac Jones's last good season was 3 years ago now at this point. Doesn't really have the anticipation, doesn't really have the mobility, maybe can't throw under pressure quite as well, especially this season. But I don't think that that was always the case. The Patriots literally broke him over time. Mentally, he was a wreck by the end of this Patriots tenure. Yes, technically he's still under contract. I can't imagine that he's going to be back with the Patriots next year. But they had no weapons for him. They had no offensive line for him. And the coaching situation was just a disaster over the years, the way that he had 3 different offensive coordinators in 3 different years with the Patriots, including, of course, Matt Patricia, who is sort of the touch of death, almost a sense, as far as development and if your team has actual expectations on that side of the ball. So, I don't want to talk too much on Mac Jones here specifically, but everybody talks about how it's just Mac Jones, and he was never the level of prospect as Bryce Young. Justin Fields is another guy where everybody on national media now that the Bears are a conversation talks about the fact that the Bears did absolutely nothing to help Justin Fields, that nobody could have ever succeeded under those circumstances. But they addressed their offensive line. It still wasn't great, but it was better than it was a couple years ago when it was Nick Foles starting the offense. And they went out and they got a number 1 wide receiver in DJ Moore and a number 1 tight end in Cole Kmet. Those were solid options that they had. David Montgomery was a good running back for them at some time, but there's nothing that ever could have happened as far as a quarterback prospect walking into Chicago and succeeding there. That's sort of the narrative that's spinning right now. I don't think that that's really the case. I think that, it's just strange how we pick and choose which quarterback prospects we sort of defend and which guys it's pure skill and which guys it is the environment. So this is a little bit of a ramble right now, but getting into this Bryce Young conversation, it sort of piqued my interest because on ESPN, they made a redraft of the 2023 NFL draft, and this was done with a collection of different reporters. They're NFL Network reporters, and it was essentially a draft between all of them. There were no trades allowed, and this wasn't, one guy sitting down and putting different guys in different places. This is reporters of the team going back in retrospect and making these picks. Bryce Young in this situation fell from number 1 outside of the top 10 to number 11. And a lot of people online were pissed about it, talking about the disrespect to Bryce Young and just how unfair it was that the Panthers did to him. And I still am openly admitting this was not Bryce Young's fault. The season went this way. I just also feel like we're sort of waiting around this season to ever see some sort of a flash, and I just don't think that it came. It's easy to look back at the Texans, where I'm not directly comparing them, but we all love Nico Collins now. We all love Tank Dell. Tank Dell was a rookie. Nico Collins was with the Texans for a couple of years, but was entirely ineffective. Their run game, I mean, last year I guess more or less it was the same from last year to this year. This year it was just more Singletary than Dameon Pierce, but it's not that CJ Stroud was in a bad situation at all. But if CJ Stroud wasn't as good as he was, we wouldn't be looking at some of these pieces around him quite as positively as we currently are. The Panthers are a mess. Their owner is very dislikable for a lot of people, throwing drinks onto fans during the games. David Tepper, and he's taking a step back. We'll sort of see. And all of this to be said, I'm definitely not writing out Bryce Young yet, but I just find it very interesting the way that it's all excuses for him, despite the fact that the best game that was played by a quarterback last season for the Carolina Panthers was Andy Dalton early in the season against the Seahawks. We just never even really got a flash of that positive Bryce Young. They were pretty unwatchable for a lot of the year. The closest they came was when they pushed the Packers a little bit down the stretch of the season. I know that the Packers defense sort of reared its head a little bit in their playoff games, but this was a Packers defense that was heavily scrutinized all season because of Joe Barry. Packers fans were calling for the firing of Joe Barry, and so maybe there was a little bit of momentum there in that individual moment, but really for the most part, I just don't think that there were, what was the memorable Bryce Young moment from this year? I just don't really think there was one. And I'm definitely not writing him out. They are going to need to surround him with more talent. But I just feel like the national perception from a lot of, casual is maybe not the right word, but the typical NFL fan is that Bryce Young deserves zero of the blame for how bad last year was. And, I just don't think that that should fully be the case. In this redraft, you had CJ Stroud going number 1 overall. I mean, do they win many more games? No, but I kind of feel like CJ Stroud could have had the potential to pull out at least a couple more of those games than they did. Number 2 pick in this redraft was Anthony Richardson, which is a little questionable. Anthony Richardson, he really flashed when he came into the season the way that he was playing. He obviously dealt with injuries even from his second game, and then was ultimately out for the year after taking a hard hit a couple games later. So, this was somebody that was definitely climbing up draft boards a lot going into the year. We didn't get to see a lot of him this season, but I don't necessarily disagree or have any problems with him being taken above Bryce Young in this redraft. A lot of people are just mad about the fact that he fell out of the top 10. And, a lot of NFL guys really liked Bryce Young as a prospect coming into this season. So, is it fair for him to drop down 10 spots? I don't know necessarily. I'm not an expert on college football. So, obviously, what all of these guys saw pre-draft to the point where he wasn't... The Panthers weren't given any scrutiny for the decision to draft Bryce Young at the time. And they're still not getting any, which means that Bryce Young should be... that he is still a pretty good prospect for the Panthers going forward. What they do to surround him with talent is definitely still up in the air. And I guess maybe it's just the way that I have a problem with the way that everybody as a whole sort of evaluates this position. I feel like we just pick and choose so much when it is a quarterback's fault based off of whether or not we like them or not. Because how much, and again, not perfect scenarios. I know that Zach Wilson had a number 1 receiver, at least in Garrett Wilson, but how much better was Bryce Young's rookie season than anything Zach Wilson has ever put out there? Again, not a perfect comparison, but I feel like to some level, Bryce Young deserves some criticism. I'm not trying to be a jerk here or anything or wish ill will on any player. I just think that as a football society almost, we sort of need to come up with more defined expectations for these quarterbacks, because when it's Zach Wilson in a national market trying to lead the charge and take the team over the hump, another team that has not been very good for the majority of the past 10 plus years, he is immediately the problem. The offensive line has never been good for him there. He's had one good receiver, but that's about it. And he is being thrown off the cliff, essentially, as far as the way that NFL fans treat him versus Bryce Young, who, again, definitely was a better prospect than Zach Wilson coming into the year. But I think that he just has a lot to prove still. And I don't think that a lot of NFL fans sort of feel the same way as me, but we'll see with next season. I think that it also sort of becomes maybe a little bit harsher circumstances, for me at least, because the Panthers decided to give up as much as they did to go get Bryce Young. And this isn't trying to be an indictment on himself. It's maybe more of an organizational thing. It's not his fault that they did give up all these assets to go get him with the number 1 pick, but they're going to have a lot of work to do to sort of turn this thing around. And I just have a little bit of doubts whether or not Bryce Young is the one who's going to be able to overcome this. So that is all I have on Bryce Young and the Panthers for now. Again, not trying to spread negativity really or anything. I guess I'm just more frustrated with the overall NFL discourse that comes with these young quarterbacks and the way that we evaluate the position. But we're going to be taking our second break. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be talking NFL and the Milwaukee Bucks after they drop another one last night. So stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Moving on to the NBA now. We are going to be taking a look at the Milwaukee Bucks, who last night they drop another game, fall to 1-4 since Doc Rivers has taken over as head coach on the sidelines for them. And we're just going to be sort of asking that question, at what point should we start to worry about the Bucks? Because I want to get ahead of things here. I'm not saying the time is now. They do lose to the Phoenix Suns last night, 114-106, but this was a game without Damian Lillard and without Brook Lopez. And then later in the first half, they lost Chris Middleton to a little bit of a freak incident where he came down off of a jump shot onto Kevin Durant's foot and rolled his ankle, so he was ruled out for the rest of that game. Did not come back. So the Bucks were essentially down 3 starters for the majority of this game. This is also coming against the Phoenix Suns, who are one of the best teams in the Western Conference, in the upper echelon of teams in the NBA really as a whole right now. So I don't think that you can get on the Bucks too much really for this loss in particular. It was a lot of Giannis just trying to do everything that he possibly could to keep this team afloat with the lack of help that he was getting. And credit him to pushing. He went down at one point. It looked like he was dealing with some sort of pulled something in his lower back, but he is just such a competitor. I don't think that he really gets the credit that he deserves as far as going out and competing on a nightly basis. He has been really just, I consider him a joy to watch. I know it's not always the most beautiful brand of basketball. There's not the shot making or anything crazy like that, but I just think it's cool to watch this force of nature go to work the way that he does. So it's been a fun watch, but that being said, he obviously is in that top 3, top 4 players in the NBA, and you go out and you acquire a Damian Lillard because Giannis was so hyper-focused on wanting to be a championship contender for this season and the seasons to come that he wasn't fully committal on re-signing with the Bucks until their front office showed that they were as well. So they go out and they acquire Damian Lillard in a trade. They give up Drew Holiday and Grayson Allen and various other things to make this move to get another top-tier player who is going to be starting in the All-Star game this year. Up for debate whether or not Lillard deserves that, but they come out expectations to win pretty much every single night, but that wasn't just enough for them during the course of the season, because when they fired Adrian Griffin, they were the 2nd seed in the East. They were 30-13. So clearly winning alone wasn't enough. They knew that something needed to change. A lot of people talk about the fact that the defense was not good enough, but I think that it probably stemmed a little bit. It sounds like he sort of lost the locker room. Reporters have talked about the fact, I know Chris Haynes specifically covered, at least at the time, during that in-season tournament, there was a little bit of a falling out between him and some of the guys on the team, including Bobby Portis and others, and they didn't fully seem to see eye to eye. So they end up letting him go. They bring in Doc Rivers, who has been known to be very well liked by his players and has had a lot of success throughout the course of his career, but he's also had, obviously, his sort of blemishes on his resume, the blown 3-1 leads with 3 different teams, and coming up short last year against the Celtics. A lot of people defend the job that he had to do against Philly last year. I think that is fair. It wasn't super ideal circumstances given that you were relying so heavily on James Harden, and James Harden just seemed to quit for the second half of the season. So, a lot of people give him a little bit of a pass for the 76ers experiment, but he comes into this situation and they start to drop some games. They are 1-4 since he's taken over, like I mentioned, has a couple blown leads, and really they've been struggling as a whole in the second halves. That's when it sort of got away from them last night against the Suns, but they scored just 19 points in the third quarter against the Denver Nuggets that allowed them to build up the lead that they carried throughout the game. Portland, that in that really bad Trailblazers loss, that's when they took over, got the lead up to 10 points early in the fourth quarter, and yeah, they battled back some and ended up making that a close game, but they came out flat in the third quarter, and really in that one, defense is obviously still a big part of this conversation. The defense in that game was atrocious from the Trailblazers, who are one of the worst teams in the league. Then against Utah, they blew a 14-point lead in the fourth quarter. They got outscored 40-13 in the fourth. So after entering the fourth quarter with a 12-point lead, they ended up getting blown out in that one. So a lot of slow starts, concerning things going on in the second halves of these games, and just asking the question about when should we start to worry about them, because this is bringing in Doc Rivers, who was not on the roster at all. This is a different scenario than just firing your head coach and having your interim coach be somebody that was already a part of the roster. This is bringing in somebody entirely new. There were some reports that he was maybe a little bit of a consultant on the side with the Bucks prior to being brought in, but he wasn't actually in the building getting to know these guys and be up there close and personal, and now he's done so. So, to the 1-4 record to start, I would like to, first acknowledge the fact that, again, they were 30-13 when they fired Adrian Griffin. Wins and losses were clearly not the only thing for that Bucks organization if they were willing to part ways with Griffin after the very successful regular season start they had. They have their eyes on the playoffs. That's all that matters for them. And this is a move that they believe can help turn them around by the time the playoffs come around. Winning a 20% rate is not in the future for the Bucks, I don't think. And, it hasn't been the easiest schedule in the world for them. That Trailblazers loss was terrible. But some of these games that they've lost to the Nuggets and the Suns. And again, the way that Jazz game played out was really bad, but that was a game on the road against the Jazz team that I think has really been figuring things out and are a really tough out night in and night out. Again, getting outscored 40-13 in the fourth is horrendous, and to not ever really bounce back from the way things are playing out is a very tough look. So they definitely need to get better. There's no doubt about that. But I wouldn't be going full panic mode yet. This has been such a short period of time, and we are still, I wouldn't say early in the season, but we're at the halfway point. There's still a lot of basketball to be played. We're not even at the All-Star break yet, which sort of takes me into the timeline of when we should start to worry a little bit more. Because Doc Rivers, interestingly enough, actually, was technically selected to be the head coach of the Eastern Conference because the way that the rules work out, typically the coach for the conference is the head coach of the team in the conference that has the most wins. But you're not allowed to coach the All-Star game 2 years in a row. So the Celtics' Joe Mazzulla is not eligible to coach again, so it falls onto the second seed, which is the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, I know that they've fallen since then, but they were initially the 2 seed when this was selected, so that was, interestingly enough, Doc Rivers. He has opted to sit out the All-Star game, let some of these other coaches that have been present for the entire year take over. There's an All-Star bonus that is given to these coaches, so a good move, in my opinion, on Doc Rivers. But then that takes us into, after the All-Star break, that's when we sort of have to get this thing ramped up if we're going to be considering the Bucks a legit contender. They have, what is this now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games until the All-Star break. So, again, a little bit of a short sample size here. I wouldn't be putting all too much stock. Now, I think that it's interesting sort of the lineup trends that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot less of the young guys, and I really like Andre Jackson for the Bucks. The forward out of UConn was with the championship team last year. I think that he's going to develop into a really good defender, and already we've sort of seen the older guys starting to take over the minutes. Jay Crowder playing more. Robin Lopez, I mean, again, weird injury situation last night for the Bucks, so I maybe wouldn't look too much into the lineups from last night specifically, but, that's coming out of that All-Star break is when you sort of want to start hitting your stride. And for the Bucks, I don't think that that's necessarily even fully possible to be fully getting into your groove, because they have to find their groove right now in the first place. You hope that you can maybe put some pieces of that together going forward. Before the All-Star break, Lillard's injury isn't expected to be too serious. Lopez was out for personal reasons. I believe he was having a child. I'm not 100% sure on that fact, but he's also someone that you're not going to have to worry about being out for long term. Still waiting on the Chris Middleton injury update. It says the x-rays were negative. He had a sprained ankle, so he should be fine. At least by the All-Star break, he'll be back. But, playoffs start come late March-ish. Late April-ish, I should say. And I feel like if that's the case, we should see this team really starting to formulate in March. If they're not there by then, if they're not at a point where they are figuring things out specifically on defense, then I think we start to worry. Now, part of my issue with that, though, and part of the reason why I haven't loved the Bucks all season really, is just sort of the financial situation they're in. They are in the second threshold for the salary cap, which means they're very limited in the types of moves that they can make. It's been rumored that they've been interested in different guys, DeJounte Murray, or they were also interested in Miles Bridges from the Charlotte Hornets. I don't think that they can really make any of these significant moves because I just don't think that they have the assets. They don't have the contracts to really make that work. What's more is with the new CBA agreement, they can't go out and pick up buyout guys in following the trade deadline. And I think that buyout guys have always sort of been maybe a little bit overvalued. How often, other than Kevin Love is the recent example, but I think that was a ridiculous move sort of by the Cavs to just buy him out anyways. But especially if you look how both of their seasons between the Cavs and the Heat played out last year, the Cavs definitely could have used a guy like Kevin Love, and Kevin Love helped contribute to the Heat going on to the finals. So maybe this is a bad time to make that statement, but I think historically buyout guys haven't played a huge difference in championship runs, but even if the Bucks wanted to, they can't, which is the issue. So I've been saying I think it's a personnel thing. I don't think that they can really have the flexibility that they'd like to make moves significantly in the right direction. And as a result, I don't have them as a top contender. I mean, they're in at least the top 4, obviously, but I just haven't ever really taken them all too seriously. But as far as the idea of worrying, saying they can't, because even though I haven't loved the Bucks, if Dame and if Giannis start to get going, and I don't think that there's much you can do, at least defensively, to stop them. If they can figure out a defensive identity, because that's the thing right now is playing a 7-game series, I don't think that they're going to be able to strictly out-offense a team game in and game out. I think it would have to be a lot of self-inflicted wounds in order for the Bucks defense actually to make a stand in a playoff series. But I think that we still have to give it a little more time as far as worrying. I'd say a month-ish. We'll have to check back in as it goes, but they come back from the All-Star break February 23rd, and then sort of from there we can see what trajectory this team is on, and it's something that we will continue to monitor. So we are going to be taking our last break here. When we come back on the other side, we will be sticking with the NBA. We have a trade update from the trade deadline, and we're going to be talking about some of the games from last night. So stick with us. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. In this final segment, we are going to be touching on some of the games that took place last night across the NBA. Specifically, going to be looking at the Mavericks and the Bulls. But before we get into all of that, we have a couple trades to announce. The first of which including the Boston Celtics, who just traded for Grizzlies big man Xavier Tillman. I think that this is a very solid move for the Celtics. They give up a couple of second-round picks in 2027 and 2030, so not at all too much of a real price. The Grizzlies, though, this is a team that's had so many injuries throughout the course of the season. This is a lost year for them. They don't think that they are going to see Tillman being a part of the Celtics being part of the Grizzlies long term, and in return they get a couple second round picks. This is probably just a 1-year rental for the Celtics, but also just giving up a couple of second rounders that, we saw the Celtics come the NBA draft. They just kept rolling over these first round picks. They had initially gotten a first round pick in the Marcus Smart deal, but instead they just kept trading back and acquiring all these different second round picks, trading those for more second round picks. So it was really just to acquire, general assets like that to make these types of moves. And they end up with Tillman, who I think is a very good defender. He was very significant, I felt like, in that Lakers series last season. The Grizzlies obviously come up short, but Celtics adding him for a bench guy is a pretty solid move. I had been wondering why Tillman wasn't getting more minutes for the Grizzlies, and I'm excited to see him in the green and white. And the other trade we have to announce is the Detroit Pistons, who we talked about on the show earlier this week, have sort of been weird about how they view themselves. They want to actually acquire talent as opposed to sort of sell off. They trade for Utah forward Simone Fontecchio. Fontecchio, someone that a lot of people probably don't know in the national media, but I've really liked his game this year. I think he's a very good three-point shooter. He kind of came out of nowhere onto the scene as far as getting these significant minutes consistently the way he has this year, but he's a very solid player. I probably would have liked him more in a situation that is a little more win now. He probably wouldn't be a starter necessarily on maybe one of these other teams, but I think that he can give very good minutes at least. And you know what, for Detroit, this is probably a fine move. Obviously, I feel like the Pistons are so interesting because they should ideally already have their franchise guys in place between Cade and Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren. They have different players at different positions, but if they are trying to sort of raise that floor and establish more of the culture, I don't hate that move. That was for some second rounders as well. So again, pretty low stakes trades, but it is more than we have gotten up to this point. So that's a little trade update for you. Now moving on to my thoughts on the Mavs and Bulls games from last night. The Minnesota Timberwolves blew another lead and really have just not looked up to scale lately. Their late game offense has just been really messy for them. Now, the Bulls were flying around last night. I was actually very encouraged from them, which puts me in this weird position because going into this game, as they are down 23 points, I'm thinking, God, they just have to blow it up. And they're not going anywhere. And while that's still probably the case, they end up coming back specifically by the hands of Coby White. Coby White is a most improved player candidate for the season. When I did my mid-season awards, I initially had Tyrese Maxey, and almost immediately I had regrets about the fact that I didn't go with Coby White instead, just because we already knew Tyrese Maxey was good heading into this year. Coby White has, coming out of nowhere, is definitely dramatic, but he went from being a bench guy, a sort of maybe 20 minutes a game guy, to an every night starter for them, and he has been tremendous. He struggled in the first half, 3 points on just 1 of 7 shooting, but went off down the stretch. He finished with 33, in the second half on, because this game did go to overtime. He shot 10 of 14, and he's becoming their guy. Part of the issue, though, that I have with the Bulls here is that they have somebody already there who, in his eyes, is the guy, and that is DeMar DeRozan. And DeMar DeRozan, I think, is somebody who can definitely help contribute to a winning team. But for the Bulls, I think it sort of log jams their development as a young core. And, it's so much DeMar DeRozan down the stretch. It's always looking to him for the game winner. They did so again last night, where they had called the timeout with 2 seconds left. And it was just the same old DeMar DeRozan at the corner, spinning, fading, and this one was a miss. And I like DeMar DeRozan a lot. Again, I think that this idea of being able to get to your spot and take the shots when other people may be scared to is a valuable thing. And I think that it can be valued more on different rosters. But for the Bulls, I think it just sort of takes away from the development of these guys. Coby White specifically is one of the guys that I'm looking at here, but they just they need to hit that reset button. They've had to for a couple years now. Now, Nikola Vucevic, he had a quote a few days ago about thinking that they have enough, was the quote. I'm not sure what enough is for. Like, it's enough for making the play-in tournament again, but they're just not the level of contenders that they seemed like they could have been for that first half stretch when everybody was healthy for them. Lonzo was there. They were the best defensive team in the league, essentially, and it just has sort of fallen apart from there. And, I don't blame them for trying to push their chips in a little bit and go for it, because at the time the East seemed like it was a little more open. LeBron James was just leaving the Eastern Conference. You still had the Celtics sort of coming up in age, and the Bucks at that point were unproven, so it wasn't a bad move at the time, I feel like. But now you have to sort of reconsider and reevaluate the situation, and that is they are not a top 5, probably not a top 6, probably not a top 7 team in the conference. And again, I don't like the idea really of tanking in this season because of the quality of the draft, but I think it's more just maximizing the value of the assets that you have. And I think that DeRozan and Caruso are too good to be playing on this team that just isn't very good themselves. So I would like to see them move. There was an interesting stat that Kenny Beecham tweeted out last night it was this morning actually, talking about the on-off differential with DeMar for Coby White, and they were significantly better with Coby on the field, on the court. And I just feel like they sort of need to pick a direction, because one playoff appearance since 2018, which was a first round exit even then. So they just need to sort of restock here. And no, they don't have their superstar really, or even their true star, but it seems like Coby White is blossoming into something for them. I would give him the keys. Just guarantee yourself a better lottery position and just try and evaluate some of these younger guys. Patrick Williams Jr., Pat Williams, he hasn't been great for them really since being drafted. It was, if you remember back to the consensus at the time, it was that he was a little bit of an overdraft, but he's still shown flashes at time. I just think that they need to sort of hit that reset button and try and move on from here. On the other end of the NBA slate last night, we had the Dallas Mavericks playing the Brooklyn Nets. This was Kyrie Irving's return to Barclays Center, and he came out with some vengeance for sure. He was incredible. Him and Luka combined for 71 points. He had 36, I believe, himself, and he just sort of ran it up against this former team. Had some interesting comments after the game talking about this shoulda, coulda, woulda with the Brooklyn Nets and giving a very Kyrie answer that we're sort of used to about the idea of the potential what could have beens and all of that. But instead, he is on the Mavs now, and the Mavs have really been showing out. I talked about them earlier this week, I think that they should sort of buy into this roster. Their offense is so good. As far as how far their offense can carry them alone, 4 rounds sounds like a lot to just lean on really those 2 guys, plus Tim Hardaway Jr., who has also been an incredible scorer for them. And, I like some of their role pieces with Derrick Jones Jr. and Dante Exum, Maxi Kleber coming off the bench. And again, I gave this whole sort of roster okay, but I think that they need to address the defense more. And I think that they have a tradable contract with Grant Williams that you could send him and some other stuff to Portland to possibly get Jeremy Grant, or maybe try and find a Dorian Finney-Smith in the market. I think that they need a wing defender because this team, you never know with Kyrie is the thing. But here's also the argument, is they did invest into Kyrie Irving. I personally wouldn't have if I were in the position, but they thought that it was worth investing into, and you're finally getting a committed Kyrie Irving the first time he's been committed to a team in years. So now you have to sort of make the most of it. They're still in this Luka situation where they have to a little bit worry about keeping him bought into the franchise and not wanting to go anywhere else. It's been fine for now. Luka seems legit happy playing with Kyrie Irving. Kyrie hit a couple huge threes down the stretch where Luka almost looked amazed. And this is Luka, who is just as good as a scorer as anybody else is in the NBA today. And he just seems to be happy that he finally has this running mate that he has full confidence in, that he doesn't have to carry the load fully by himself. Jalen Brunson was a good player on Dallas, obviously, but he, at the time, too, hadn't really fully established himself as quite the level that he was. He wasn't as refined of a scorer or a leader in general because he was still sort of building up his confidence and his skills to even himself personally know that he was the guy on that level. And they bought into this identity of just running the offense, shooting the heck out of the ball, and having a couple wing guys that you can just plug in if you just stand there and watch. Grant Williams had an interesting quote the other day talking about where you just kind of stand there and eat, eating popcorn, and when Luka hits you, you just got to knock down the shot, which is a little reductive, especially maybe talks a little bit. I don't have questions about Grant's effort on defense, but maybe sort of an example of just the way that this team doesn't really seem to have a true defensive identity. I know that he was talking about the offensive side of the ball in this quote, so I don't want to sort of myself aggregate it or anything, but I think that this is a Mavericks team that, are they finals contenders? No, but if they can find any form of a more reliable defense, I think that, and these guys are both engaged in playing. We saw Luka single-handedly pretty much carry the Mavericks to a conference finals a couple years ago. If you add a committed Kyrie Irving to that, I think things get really dangerous in the West, where there are a couple teams that maybe don't have necessarily the same level of experience and defense. So I don't know. If I'm the Mavericks and I'm Mark Cuban, I'm trying to buy in. You already bought into Kyrie Irving because you want to sort of speed up this timeline and get Luka a real championship contender. I think you should follow through with that movement as a whole and go for it. So that is all I have for today. Thank you very much for listening. We will be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Just a quick update. Friday, we're going to be running the show at 8 o'clock p.m. as Eastern Time as opposed to 2. So just a heads up there. But thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show.